Article 4, Section 13 states, in Minnesota law at Minnesota Statutes 2.021, provides that the Minnesota House is comprised of 134 members. A quorum is 68 members. A majority is 68 members. Neither caucus has a majority. We have to work together to get things done, and we would like to do that starting on the first day. With that, I'll turn it over to Floor Leader Jamie Long.
Well, it's a bit ironic that on January 6th, we're talking once again about stealing an election, but in the Republican press conference, you all asked their intentions with regards to Representative Tabke, and they were very clear that they intend to use a temporary situation where they have a one vote advantage but not a majority to kick out a duly elected member. And for those who have followed that case closely, you know that there were 21,980 folks who voted in that election who will be disenfranchised if that election result is overturned. The election margin was 14. There were 20 ballots that were lost. The election administrator testified in that trial that she knew with beyond a reasonable doubt who those 20 individuals were. And we had 6 of those individuals testify that they voted for Representative Tabke, and 6 testified that they voted for his opponent. So there is no mathematical way that his opponent won the election. Representative Tabke won the election based on the evidence that was presented in court. And yet, you heard the Republicans say that they are going to use their advantage to kick out Representative Tabke, try to win a special election, and try to get to a place where they have a majority in the House going forward. We're here to try to work with them, to try to come to the table, to try to have power sharing, which we will have, we know, when we win the special election in late January, and that's the goal.
Happy to take questions.
What does that mean that you, when you're talking about quorum, we all just stay out in the rotunda on the first day and make sure there's not 68 electeds in that room at any given time?
Well, the rotunda wouldn't be a very good place to be. Abraham Lincoln tried that when he was a senator in the state of Illinois. He went to the state house to tell the other party that he was not going to provide quorum, and they locked the doors. And then he tried to climb out a window, and they said, "Too bad, we counted you already." So I don't think that you would be seeing us in the Capitol building.
So are you going to be here? Are you? I mean,
we'll be meeting with constituents in our districts. We'll be meeting with mayors, police chiefs, fire chiefs, working with staff, drafting bills. Hopefully it doesn't come to that, right? When you think about what's going on right now, we're in negotiations with Republicans, very similar to labor and management when they have negotiations. No union wants to go out on strike. But if they get to an impasse, first they'll do an informational picket. That's kind of what you're seeing here today. And if they have to preserve the rights of the workers, they will go out on strike. And the people in the union check to make sure there's no scabs and nobody's going to cross the picket line. So we are united in our resolve to negotiate with the Republicans and to achieve a power sharing agreement before the first day of session. We have no interest in denying quorum or using other parliamentary tactics. I mean, I think you saw that business can be obstructed by filibuster. The Republicans demonstrated that over a 3-week period last May. There are other tools in the toolbox, and denial of quorum is just one of them.
So to be clear, you will not show up on the House floor on day one unless things change from where they are now, from what Republicans say they plan to do.
If there's no power sharing agreement, we will not be here.
Are you concerned about the optics of that to voters with an election less than 2 years away, this unprecedented move to not have any Democrats show up?
We don't lightly consider that as a tactic. We think that it's pretty straightforward that Minnesotans delivered a tie. In fact, Leader Demuth has said over and over, even in her recent press appearances, even here today at 12:15, Minnesotans delivered a tied House. And they expect us to govern as a tied House. This is an opportunity for us to have the most collaborative and the most bipartisan session ever. There's a really simple choice in front of us right now: to fight or to collaborate. And we are here saying we're here to collaborate, we're here to work together. They can't even turn on the lights without us. They can't pass a bill, they can't move a committee report. So to pretend that they have a majority while acknowledging they can't do a single thing with 67 votes just shows that the naivete of their current position.
So you will be here between January 14th and whenever the decision is made on Representative Tabke's seat?
My prediction is that we will have a great power sharing agreement worked out before January 15th, but 14th, but if we don't, we won't be here.
Are you
Just what
worried
about
if you
threats?
take that approach that they will try and pursue recall elections and potentially, move this process even further into a difficult direction?
Right, I heard Representative Niska talking about the grounds for recall. We don't plan to engage in nonfeasance. We plan to engage in activity as legislators, and one of the tactics that a legislator can use to exert power is denial of quorum. We will be doing our jobs fully from the moment that the legislative session is supposed to start.
They acknowledge that they can't pass bills, et cetera, with 68 votes, but they're arguing, their interpretation is that when one seat is vacant with 40B, they can elect a speaker, they do have a quorum to open the session with 67 votes. So who does that go to? If they try to do that and they gavel in and elect Amos the speaker, are you gonna sue them? Like, does the chief clerk decide? Like, who's the arbiter?
The chief clerk
Yeah.
is the repository of information about how Minnesota calculates quorum. Minnesota law is absolutely clear. We follow the majority rule for calculating quorum, which is a majority of the total number of the members in the body. There is a minority rule, and the U.S. House of Representatives follows the minority approach, but that is not the approach that either the Minnesota House or the Minnesota Senate follow. So they won't have a quorum. I thought it was very interesting when you repeatedly asked her about that. She never did say that they have a quorum. She knows they don't have a quorum. She assumes that we're going to show up. We're not going to show up and have them illegitimately seize power.
Have you talked to the Secretary of State? Because I believe constitutionally he has to convene the chamber. Would you urge him not to?
I haven't talked to the Secretary of State about how messy the first day of session could be since right after the election when we were talking about election returns. So back in November, he and I chatted about his role as a presiding officer and how it could be interesting. But I think that he was a member of this body for I think around 12 years. He's very clear on the rules. They're not ambiguous. And I'm sure he will find that a quorum is not present and that the session concludes at that point. We've had this happen a lot. There have been snowstorms, so there's plenty of journal entries where they take the roll and a quorum is not present and the meeting's over.
I'd like to ask you about District 40B, because, I mean, part of the reason we're in this situation is what's going on with that. You had a member who a judge ruled did not have residency requirements. How did that happen, and can you explain, was there a vetting process? How did the DFL party not know that that could be a possibility, and you've lost the seat here temporarily?
We have a vetting process, and we ask all of our candidates to fill out a form to certify where they live. We did have somebody whose driver's license didn't have their home address a couple of years ago, so we implemented some procedures, and we followed those procedures. Certainly, we disagree with the findings by the trial court. Many folks believe that Curtis Johnson lived in that apartment and that he was doing what he needed to do to establish residency in that district. And it was certainly something people asked about. He made the decision based on the trial court's decision not to pursue his appeal at the Minnesota Supreme Court, not to pursue an appeal on the floor of the Minnesota House, and that is his right to make that decision.
So you still think that he legitimately won that seat? And
It really doesn't matter, does it? He did win the seat. He got 7,500 more votes than the Republican, but
legitimately, if he didn't live there.
well, I believe he was legitimately a resident of the district, but the trial court disagreed, and the candidate has now made, the elected individual made a decision about what to do going forward. So it kind of doesn't matter at this point. We have a candidate. His name is David Gottfried. We anticipate that David Gottfried will win the special election on January 28th, and most likely a certificate of election will be issued on or before February 3rd.
Did you try to convince him to keep challenging that?
I'm not going to go into that.
What about the timing of that special election? The last residency challenge, Bob Barrett, the special election did not happen until well into February, and you know about the lawsuit. We're going to hear about that later from the party chair. What about that timing? Is that legit?
Yeah, I think that the Bob Barrett case, I don't know, is that Palenti or Dayton? It certainly wasn't under Walls. But there is a statute that's really clear, and it says, of course, I don't have my cheaters on, if a vacancy becomes clear, the governor absolutely has to call a special election as soon as possible to fill the vacancy. Minnesota law is tilted towards filling vacancies very rapidly, particularly during the legislative session. So in the Barrett case, I believe what happened was he was actually stricken from the ballot. So there was an election and he wasn't on the ballot. And I want to say that the special election, I feel like I remember door knocking in January. I feel like that was an end of January type special election, but it was pretty quick.
How much does it help to be lawyers, maybe having?
Maybe a little. And, maybe 20 years of experience serving in the Minnesota House of Representatives. Some of these things are absolutely clear. And over 20 years, I've seen Oregon Republicans deny quorum. I've seen Texas Democrats deny quorum. I've seen Wisconsin Democrats deny quorum. It's something that happens around the country. It is not a common legislative tactic, but it is used.
And can authorities be involved to compel you to attend? We've seen that in other states. Is that possible in Minnesota?
It is
law?
not, because the House is not organized. It will have no clerk. It will have no sergeant at arms. So it will have no ability to send anyone. And there is no authority in Minnesota law for them to send somebody out to pick us up.
So what kind of conversations are continuing to happen about power sharing agreements? Are you regularly meeting with Leader Dameth? If that's the end goal, how are you going about trying to reach that?
Yeah, we met yesterday in the retiring room at 1 p.m. and I made an offer, and she rejected the offer. And I invited her to make a counteroffer, and she indicated she didn't see that happening in the near future. Basically, she doesn't believe that we're serious, and we are serious. I think when you look at the January calendar, between when we are supposed to start and when the special election happens and the new person will be sworn in, we could have 9 committee hearings, and we could have 6 session days. And Republicans could chair 4 committee hearings, and Representative Dameth could preside for 3 of the 6 session days. Or if we deny quorum, there'll be 0 committee hearings, there'll be 0 Republicans chairing any committee hearings, and there'll be 0 instances of Leader Dameth in the rostrum as speaker. So we think a shared power agreement is in the interest of both parties.
So if Topkey isn't seated, does the governor need to call a special session in your mind? Like you just talked about the need for filling vacancies quickly, so.
We anticipate that Brad Tabke will be seated because he won the election.
And if he's not, the governor has to call a special
We
election.
believe that he will be seated. And part of the reason that we're willing to walk the picket line is to ensure that that happens.
Will you literally be walking the picket line?
We will not literally be walking the picket line. It's a figurative picket line.
Please do, that would be good optics.
What about a special session? Is there any talk about calling a special session so that the legislature is convened and then the 22-day clock could start?
The time for a special session has expired. The prior terms are over. As of, I believe it was either midnight last night or noon today, the new terms have started. So the Representative Jean Pawlowski, for example, is no longer a currently serving representative. So through yesterday, a special session could be called, but at this point in time, it would not be appropriate.
Speaker Hortman, on policy, the Republicans talked about repealing the Social Security tax, ending the nuclear moratorium, legislation about fraud. Where do you stand? Could you reach agreement on some of those things?
Those are all great issues for us to talk about in committee hearings and try to find bipartisan compromise. We're really excited about the idea of working with Republicans on Minnesota's budget to make sure we have a sound budget from here and into the future, and serving Minnesotans, whether it's in energy or education, joining with the governor and building on the work that we did last year to combat fraud. We're excited to work with Republicans on that. We're not really interested in this kind of a waste of time in January. Those would all be great topics for us to have bipartisan hearings on in January.
Do all House Democrats live in their districts?
Yes, they do.
What about the new committee? Can I circle back on fraud? Did you hear about the formation of a new committee and committee chair?
We have an agreement on what the committees are. It was, I believe, publicly released on November 15, 16, 17, 18, somewhere in there. So you know what the committees are, you know who's on them, and you know who's chairing them.
And members being struck, did you hear Republicans say that they're going to strike Democratic members?
Well, since they can't turn on the lights, they won't be able to strike anybody from anything.
What do you mean by that they can't turn on the lights?
They can't conduct business without a quorum. The only thing they can do is come in, take the roll, and leave.
What about, but Lisa Damon just said that there's precedent twice for 67 votes.
There is, but in both of those cases, there was a quorum. In one of those cases, the Republicans had a legitimate majority of 68 seats. I believe it was Steve Swigum, and they had a Grouchy member who didn't want to vote for him, but they did have 68 members. And the only other time it's happened was pursuant to the power sharing agreement. In 1979, on the first day of the power sharing agreement, the Democrats were also down one seat. They had a member who had a heart attack. And Republican Rod Searle was implored by the conservative members of his caucus to go in and seize control, be the speaker, redraft the committees, take over. And what Rod Searle said is that's an exercise in futility, because it's them today, but it could be us tomorrow. If somebody's sick or somebody's absent, then every single day, today the Democrats are in charge because somebody's out sick on the Republican side, and tomorrow the Republicans are in charge because somebody's out sick. And in the 60 days that Representative Demuth and I negotiated, we determined that that was not any kind of a way to run a legislature. And that what would be in the best interest of all the members is to have rules and an agreement that allows people to be gone sick and not screw up the whole legislative session.
Can I ask Representative Long a question? This has to do with how a legislature could exercise the constitutional provision that the House is the judge of, ultimate judge of its own election. And let's say Johnson was here and we were at 67. Could they not do this anyway? Meaning make a motion, Tabke then can't vote on this motion. They would then have a majority of those present to deny Tabke's seat. This isn't dependent on the Johnson vacancy necessarily, is it?
Well, so there was a court ruling, as you know, in the Curtis Johnson case, and Curtis himself decided not to appeal. The House is
And in the Pavlik case, there was a court ruling.
That's right. And in the Pavlik case, there was a court ruling as well that came out in favor of, against Pavlik at the time. So in both of those instances, the end result here is that the court ruling has been upheld, right? In this instance, because Representative Curtis Johnson chose not to appeal. So we didn't have to make the decision ourselves. We, as you point out, as the House, do have the ability to determine our own members. But in all past instances, the court ruling has been respected. And in this case, with Representative Tabke, it is entirely clear, based on testimonial evidence that was presented in court under oath, who the winner was, including testimony from the election administrator in Scott County. So there is zero ambiguity. The fact that the GOP stood up here today and said 20 voters are going to be disenfranchised. Well, we know that 6 of those voters voted for Representative Tabke, and we know that that puts the election out of reach, and 21,980 voters would be disenfranchised if we go to a special election where we know fewer of those voters are going to turn out.
But the judge hasn't ruled in that case yet, and also there was testimony that there's no 100% certainty those were the voters.
The standard in a legal case is preponderance of the evidence, and in a civil case. In a criminal case, it's beyond a reasonable doubt. Both of those thresholds were met. 100% certainty is not what's required, but the election official testified that she had no doubt that those were the 20 voters, and that's exactly what happened, and that they heard from those voters.
Well, she said she had some doubt. She couldn't say 100%, so that is some doubt.
That's not the standard.
Republicans have raised the prospect of recalls potentially against your members. I mean, can you respond to that, and is that something you're
Sure.
worried about?
Representative Niska mentioned a phrase nonfeasance. We will not be not doing our jobs. We will absolutely be doing our jobs every single day, and so there'll be no basis for a recall election.
Are you going to
Do you
collect
have any-
salaries during this time as well, because you'll be meeting with constituents?
I anticipate that we will.
Have you been in communication with Representative Tabke? I mean, does he have any insight as to when this ruling might happen?
No, we're all waiting for the court. I actually was kind of surprised it didn't come out last week, but I respect the judge had the final submissions were due on December 30th. And it's only been, 2 days post-holidays that she has had the completed file in front of her.
If the judge rules in your Tabke's favor, what happens then?
We imagine he'll be seated. We'll show up and we'll be ready to work as soon as we have a power sharing agreement.
Are you open to the idea of a fraud committee? Is there proposing?
I mean, I think we're certainly interested in oversight. We did a lot of work in 23 and 24 because obviously Feeding Our Future was a COVID era fraud scandal. And so we did a ton of work in 23 and 24, and we're happy to build on that work. We have very, very strict new requirements in Minnesota state law with regard to grants and grants oversight, and we'd be happy to partner with our Republican colleagues. We have no interest in anybody ripping off Minnesota state government. We want the taxpayers' dollars to be used for the things that they intend it to be used for.
Do you have the other, okay.
Oh, does it take a new committee to do it though?
It doesn't. I mean, and really, it doesn't actually make sense to put it in one committee because the Education Committee should be looking at the education programs, the Health and Human Services Committee should be looking at the Health and Human Services spending, the Public Safety Committee should look at the public safety spending, and those folks would be more expert in what's going on in those agencies.
Two of the other priorities Damith mentioned were, I guess, updating the DREAM Act to carve out undocumented immigrants from the new college scholarship, free college program, and repealing the rest of the taxes on Social Security income. Are those things that your caucus is open to, or are those non-starters for you?
They sound pretty non-starter-ish, but they are the kinds of things that a member can introduce a bill and ask for a hearing, and under the power sharing agreement, 50% of the hearings would be led by Republicans, 50% of the hearings would be led by Democrats. I'm sure that they would want to have hearings on those issues, and we could have a good discussion and see if there's any middle ground on that.
What do you have to say to Minnesotans who are worried about the legislature getting stuff done with all of this happening?
This is pretty typical for the legislature to have a lot of conflict and arguments, and when you look at the way that legislative disputes are resolved, things work themselves out. It's early, it's a full week before we need to convene. We have lots of time to come together and discuss how we can work together, and I'm confident that we will.
Prior to all this kind of falling apart, was there a framework for what a speakership could look like under power sharing?
Yes,
What was that?
absolutely shared power. So very similar layout to the committees.
So two speakers?
Co-speakers, yeah.
Could I follow that? Because you mentioned the committee chairs and how they would chair 50% of the meetings and then the other one would. Would they also be able to set their agendas for that meeting, or would they need agreement from the other chair, even if they had the gavel then?
No, they would be able to set their agenda. They could agree with one another that they both didn't want to hear bills that the other didn't want to hear, but they could independently set their agendas if that's how they chose to do it.
Their day.
Right, and they could go week by week, or they could go day by day,
And speakership would have also alternated by
daily.
I'm told we have time for one more.
Is Governor Walz on board with you potentially not showing up on the first day of the session?
Governor Walz is very interested in making sure that the will of the voters is recognized and respected, and I'm confident I have his full support.
You've talked to him, has he said he's okay with this?
I talked to him a couple weeks ago when I thought it was a possibility, and he was fully supportive.
So, sorry if it's even dull here, but let's say it's day one, no power sharing agreement. You guys don't show up. They show up and they say, our interpretation is 67 out of 133 is a majority, gavel, elect the speaker. The
Steve
clerk
Simon
does
will
it.
be the presiding
Steve Simon will be the
officer.
presiding officer, so
And
that's
he will
what will
determine
stop
whether
it.
quorum is present or not.
Okay, so
And
you're
if we
relying on
don't
him to
go,
rule that there's no quorum in
there
that
will not
case.
be a quorum.
Can you address the temporary tie in the Senate as well? Does this just mean stalemate until after the 28th for both chambers in this?
I think it's a golden opportunity for the four of us to work together. You know, it's topsy-turvy over there. It's a tragic situation that we find ourselves where we are. But, you know, we had, in 23 and 24, we had several months of good, bipartisan, normal legislating. We had 3 weeks that were pretty awful. But, you know, I'm confident that given we had clear Democratic majorities, we passed things that Republicans hated, but we were able to work together in a bipartisan way for the vast majority of the 23-24 session, bodes well for the fact when we're even closer in power, if we respect each other, if we respect the voters, and if we want to get the work done, if what is a successful session to each one of us is doing the work for the people of Minnesota and not fighting with each other, I'm confident we can get there.
Thanks, everyone.